Department's Ask Me Anything event to talk about the proposed Homeless Resource Center overlay amendment. My name is Brian Young with Salt Lake City TV, and I'm the host of Capital City News, and I'm going to be your host and moderator today for this discussion. We're here this morning to talk with Nick Norris and Kelsey Lindquist from the Planning Division about how this whole thing is working. They're going to explain to us how they'd like it all to work and what they're proposing. The short version is that the Planning Division is proposing that the Salt Lake City Council adopt an overlay zoning district to regulate future homeless resource centers and homeless shelters. The overlay would be adopted into the zoning code along with updates to the existing regulations that apply to homeless resource centers and homeless shelters. This proposal is in response to the current moratorium on new homeless resource centers. The Planning Division has spent the spring and the summer gaining an understanding of how city services, neighborhoods, service providers, and those that use current shelters could be impacted by the changes in this proposal. So this is being discussed today. Everything that's being discussed today was created and shaped by the input they received over the rest of the previous part of the year. So Nick and Kelsey are going to give us a presentation about the issue and the process, after which they will be answering your questions. To submit a question at any time during this presentation, we're live on Facebook. Please use the comment function on Facebook. City staff is going to be monitoring that chat and bringing those questions to us so that Nick and Kelsey can answer those questions for you. And then just as a reminder, a recording of today's event is going to be made available on Facebook as well as the Salt Lake City YouTube channel. So if you want to go subscribe there, you'll be able to get the recording afterward as well. So with the introduction out of the way, I'd like to say welcome, Nick and Kelsey. Thank you very much for doing this, and take it away.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I'm Nick Norris. I'm the planning director for Salt Lake City. I'm joined today by Kelsey Lindquist, who's one of our division planning managers. And we have a couple of other individuals who are helping us in the background. Michaela Oaktai, who's the deputy planning director, and Liz Hart, one of our principal planners. Kelsey, would you mind sharing the presentation that we have?
Not a problem.
All right, if you could go to the next slide. All right, great, thank you. So we're going to start things off by talking about what our goals for today's presentation are. First, we want to give an overview of the feedback we've received so far. Then we'll dig into how that feedback was used and analyzed and ultimately leading to this proposal. Then we're going to talk about what the next steps are. And after that, we'll, as Brian said, we'll have a Q&A and have an opportunity for you to provide comments. I want to start by saying that this presentation is going to be recorded and it will be shared to be viewed later. So if for those that aren't able to attend right now, they'll be able to view it at a later time and also provide feedback. Or if you are here, you can view this again from our website, which we'll get to, and study it and digest it and give comments at, after that as well. Next slide. So let's start by talking about how you can provide feedback. Like I just said, you can visit the website listed on the bottom of this page at slc.gov/HRC-story map. Here's where you can learn about the proposal, see how homeless shelters and resource centers were approved in the past, how the process is changing, and opportunities to participate and provide input. The page also includes a specific location where you can provide your direct feedback without having to submit a separate email or write or call any staff members. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here and what the goals of the project are. In 2021, the mayor initiated changes to the zoning code to update the regulations and the process that are related to homeless shelters. This was in response to a proposed homeless shelter in the Ballpark neighborhood. In response to that, earlier this year, the city council adopted an ordinance that deleted homeless shelters as a land use in the zoning code, effectively prohibiting new homeless resource centers. This was done as a temporary measure so that we can consider a different approach to deciding the locations for future homeless shelters and resource centers. The goals of this new process were to ensure the safety and welfare of those experiencing homelessness. We also wanted to recognize that zoning is limited in the issues associated with homelessness. Zoning cannot dictate personal behavior, but it can address how land is used to achieve shared community goals. We want to understand the financial implications to the city, the service providers, and to the neighbors of future homeless resource centers. So that's factored into this proposal as well. We also want to address what happens when there's a concentration of this type of use and the related services, and how neighborhoods that host shelters are impacted differently than other neighborhoods who do not have shelters or other homeless resource services in near them. Next slide. Here's the timeline of the project and where we started earlier this year. In the spring, we met with all of the city departments who provide some response to homeless related issues in the city. We did this to help understand how they are impacted and how their services are delivered to people experiencing homelessness. In the summer, we had similar conversations with service providers, representatives from different neighborhoods, the business community, and people who are experiencing homelessness to discuss how they are impacted and what they would like to see be done differently. One of the big reasons for this discussion was to help determine those things that can be addressed by zoning and those things that cannot. This helped inform the final proposal. We had a follow-up meeting with those groups in October, and now we are kicking off the engagement process. Finally, when the City Council adopted the changes earlier this year, they gave us until January 31st of 2023 to send them a new proposal, and they gave themselves until May 3rd, 2023 to adopt a new process. If a new process is not adopted, the former process that allowed the use in the CG, that's general commercial, or D2, which is our downtown support, and D3, which is our downtown warehouse residential zoning districts, goes back into effect. Under those, the prior rules, that use was a conditional use. I'm going to turn the time over to Kelsey to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Nick. So this section of the presentation will provide, sorry about that. This section of the presentation will provide an overview of what we heard during the focus group meetings, which occurred during June and July. Planning staff engaged with several key stakeholder groups. These groups included advocates, community organization representatives, service providers, business owners, unsheltered individuals, and operators. The goal of engaging with these stakeholders was to understand the breadth of concerns and impacts that the community faces, as well as how to improve regulations for the individuals utilizing the HRCs and services. Additionally, we wanted to identify shared goals and concerns of service providers. It was vital to understanding the scope of concerns from all engaged stakeholders so that staff could address as many of those zoning-related concerns and impacts as possible. This may become repetitive, but zoning regulations cannot address every concern or impact. The feedback provided during these engagement sessions helped shape the draft ordinance, which will be discussed later in this presentation. After the stakeholder engagement series, planning organized the comments into 5 main topics. These include location, enforcement, safety, operations, and process needs. There have been a lot of identified issues and impacts, as you can see on this slide. Any zoning related issue identified in these lists will be addressed as best as possible with the proposed amendment. Any non-zoning related issue and impact will be forwarded to the applicable division or department. As a continuation of the listening series, staff also met with other city departments and divisions to understand impacts or other considerations. The goal was to create a thread between the goals of the text amendment as well as identified impacts. Additionally, we wanted to ensure that the information we heard from impacted departments aligns with the community input that we received so that we can address as many of these comments as possible. As part of this effort, some of the impacts can be addressed via a zoning tool. And as mentioned previously, the other issues and impacts will be forwarded. To better understand the current situation of the existing homeless resource centers, we conducted a map analysis with the goal to understand the breadth and complexity of the needs of the unsheltered, the community, as well as city service impacts. To do this, we analyzed existing conditions associated with current locations of the homeless resource centers and evaluated acceptable locations for future centers. What we did was create multiple maps that looked at fire districts, location of fire stations in proximity to existing homeless resource centers, land valuation, opportunity areas, existing and recurring encampments, transit locations, homeless resource center locations, grocery stores, and vacant and boarded buildings. This map shows the existing homeless resource centers. Those are the yellow stars on the map. The fire stations, red dots, track stations, purple dots, and the homeless resource center resources, which were provided by service providers, as the blue dots on the map. From these maps, we were able to determine that allowing homeless resource centers to be permitted or conditional, a permitted use or conditional use in a specific zoning district would not be equitable. By identifying standards that analyze the impacts with the potential location in terms of the service provider, the broader community, and city services was the most acceptable approach when considering where to site a future homeless resource center. And now we arrive at the proposed amendment, which is a homeless resource center overlay zoning district. Is a mouthful, but let's start with what is an overlay zoning district and how does it function? An overlay district is applied to a base zone and imposes additional requirements. As you can see in the illustration, you have your base zone on your property, and an overlay is an additional zone that has typically more requirements, additional standards that would be reviewed in addition to that base zone. So why did staff arrive at an overlay district? This provides the city to conduct more public engagement, also allows a comprehensive consideration to community issues, and enables the city council to be the final decision maker. So what are the primary differences between the conditional use, which is currently under a moratorium, and the proposed overlay zoning process? A conditional use is typically reviewed at an administrative level, meaning planning commission. This has the base amount of required community engagement. That means there's a 45-day public noticing period and then notices associated with that public hearing. The zoning amendment process requires a great deal of community engagement. So it does, again, have the 45-day public input, heavy department and division input. You would have a public hearing with the planning commission, a future public hearing and work session with the city council, and then ultimately the city council would make that decision. And at this time, I will turn it back over to Nick to get into the specifics about this district.
Great, thank you, Kelsey. As Kelsey mentioned, to apply to approve a future homeless shelter or resource center would require a zoning map amendment. That proposal could be generated by a property owner, a service provider with the property owner's consent, or if they are the property owner, or the city. Applying the overlay has its own set of factors that the city council would consider in making the decision. The factors are intended to provide the council with the best information possible so a data-driven decision can be made. The standards that address how an HRC operates are being updated, mainly to clear up roles and responsibilities and the annual report that is required to be submitted by that operator. That way we can gauge if our regulations are working or not, and if they're not, how they might be improved in the future. We're also addressing standards for seasonal shelters. This includes adding definitions and some requirements for this use. Earlier this year, the Utah legislature adopted rules for locating seasonal shelters. The changes that are proposed reflect the state law. In the past, City Council has enacted temporary zoning regulations for emergency seasonal shelters, and sometimes because the approval process is lengthy, and sometimes because the use was not allowed in parts of the city where space was available. While the council can still take that action regardless of what's in the zoning code, this proposal is intended to ensure the city is following state code, but also to make that process quicker. Next slide. We're going to focus on the standards or the factors that the city council will be considering under this proposal. The summary is listed on the slides. And the factors would include more info and require more data than a typical zoning map amendment. It would focus on those issues specific to this type of use. Some of those include the benefits that are provided by a new shelter. Until we have housing for everyone, we know that future emergency shelter is going to be needed as our population grows and our homeless population grows. The number of beds within homeless shelters in Salt Lake City compared to the greater area would also be a factor. We recognize that Salt Lake City does more than most other communities in the region and probably should, but we also know that we can't do it all. And so that would be one of the factors that our council would be considered. We also want to consider the proximity to transportation or transportation plans so people can reach services that they need. We will also consider the impact to other city services such as police and fire. For example, about 7% of all calls of the fire department are dispatched to the 2 existing homeless resource centers. While the fire department has plans in place to ensure that other emergencies can be responded to, when one station gets more calls, it does potentially tax the ability to respond to other calls. If one station that is already responding to a land use that has a high number of calls, if there's another use that has a high number of calls in that same area, it definitely stresses their resources. We also want to consider how much one neighborhood is already being asked to shoulder. As if you refer back to that map that Kelsey shared, you can see there is a concentration of certain services, including shelters in some neighborhoods. That leads us to the proximity of other HRCs, which is another factor that the council could consider. In considering that, the real factor is whether or not the proximity to HRCs puts those people who need that service in higher risk, because we know that unfortunately our homeless population is preyed upon by certain individuals. We want to consider the impact to public spaces. This includes our sidewalks, our parks, our alleys, and other similar places. And then we want to consider the overall impact of the health and safety of those who live and or work in the area or who own properties near there. Next slide. Focusing on temporary shelters for a little bit, this would be a new use in our city code. As I mentioned earlier, these normally have been approved by our city council using what's called temporary zoning regulations. A seasonal shelter would only be allowed when the other shelters are at capacity and during freezing temperatures. One thing that we already know is that there's also a risk to unsheltered individuals during extreme heat. So that's something that we have to consider as we move through this process. This proposal would allow a temporary shelter in any zoning district that also allows hotels, motels, or multifamily housing in buildings that were constructed for lodging purposes, that contains adequate restrooms, complies with building and fire codes for life safety reasons, and is located further than 1 mile from an existing homeless resource center. The state code also includes a 1,000-foot spacing requirement from certain community locations, but gives cities the ability to waive or reduce that spacing requirement. We would follow the state code in determining that. The state code also says that seasonal shelters cannot be located within a set distance from any zone that are residential use. However, this essentially eliminates the use in most of the city except for our industrial areas. This proposal waives the residential spacing requirements so that we can actually locate a temporary shelter in our city. Importantly, the state code also limits a city from hosting an emergency shelter more than once every 4 years, unless that city agrees to host it more frequently. The primary reason for adding the temporary shelters is to ensure that the city has regulations in place that mirror state code rules so that we can determine our needs for emergency shelters in the future. Next slide. This proposal has a minimal impact on existing shelters and operators. We wanted to make sure that we were taking that into account. So any existing shelter can continue to operate just as they have in the past. Only changes in the reporting requirements would apply to an existing HRC or a homeless shelter that is subject to those rules. They are still required to comply with their original approvals and any requirements that were in place at that time. The overlay would apply only to new shelters or if an existing facility wanted to expand to property that they currently are not occupying. I'd also like to take a moment to discuss a federal law that addresses religious institutions that provide homeless services. Under the Federal Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, a religious institution is protected from providing homeless services to the point that local regulations have to treat that use at least the same way that they would treat the use of land if not operated by a religious institution. This proposal specifically authorizes any religious institution to provide homeless services, including emergency shelter, under their rights to assemble established in the Constitution. This is fairly similar to what some other cities have been starting to do, such as the city of Denver. Let's go to the next slide. So let's reshare our timeline. You can go to the next slide as well. Talk about next steps and our timeline. So we have a number of opportunities that are starting this week with this presentation and moving into next week. Next week, we have 2 events. One, the Planning Commission will be receiving a similar presentation to this so that they can become familiar with the proposal and ask questions and give staff direction prior to a public hearing in December. On November 10th, we will have an in-person open house at the Public Safety Building on 300 East and 500 South. This is an in-person opportunity only, and we will provide a similar presentation and respond to questions and take your comments as well. Given the time frame, we ask that our community organizations share the presentations from this event today or the Planning Commission briefing with your community. A link to both of these events will be shared on our project website so that they're easy to share. On December 14th, the Planning Commission will hold a public hearing on this proposal. All comments submitted through the website will be provided to the Commission for their consideration. We ask that any written comments be submitted by December 1st to be included in the staff report and analyzed. Comments received after that will still be shared, but they'll not, unfortunately, we will not have time to include those in the analysis in the report. From there, this proposal will be forwarded to the City Council for a final decision. The Council has a self-imposed deadline of adopting new regulations of May 3rd, 2023. If they don't, the formal conditional use process will automatically be reinstated. The City Council will also hold at least one public hearing that's yet to be determined. Next slide. In closing, we wanted to reiterate the ability for you to share and provide comment. We want to thank you for your time. And one more time, the website is listed on this page. We'd now like to open up the opportunity for some Q&A and for people to provide comments.
Thank you, Nick and Kelsey, for that presentation. I think that's a really great overview of what it is you're proposing. As far as questions, I have a couple of here now to ask you. The first is if I'm a resident and a homeless resource center is proposed in my neighborhood, what notice would I get so that I could participate in that process?
Yes, thank you for that question, Brian. Residents within 300 feet sorry, I got distracted. Residents within 300 feet of the subject property, as well as tenants within 300 feet of the subject property, would receive a notice upon an application being submitted. We send out early notification to all of those individuals that say the notice provides information on the application request and the project manager to provide public comment or to learn how to become more engaged. We also send notice to the applicable community council for that area and neighborhood. And typically we would do attend one of those community council meetings to answer any questions or concerns as well. There would be an additional notice for Planning Commission for the public hearing, and then subsequent notices for future city council public hearings as well.
I might add that we also will post a sign on the subject property that gives people information on upcoming meetings, how to get involved, and where to go to find out more information.
One question that's come up as well is, I think we all acknowledge that there's going to be a need for homeless resource centers, and the providers that operate these resource centers are going to have to navigate a different process. Does this add to the burden of them? Like, how does the process change for them? How does it affect them when they're, working to perform this vital service in the city?
That's a great question. Thanks, Brian. We were provided some information and public comments from service providers within the city that they voiced some concern about the timeline associated with a map amendment. Timelines can range pretty significantly when it comes to a legislative process like a map amendment. So we were provided some feedback to address concerns with that timeline, meaning we could establish some dates that we would have to meet, a planning commission hearing and a transmittal, and then subsequent hearings with city council. Staff's taking that into consideration, and I think that is why we're engaging with the public and the service providers at this point to try to gain these really important comments so that we can adjust our proposal adequately.
Hey, we have a question from Christy on Facebook, and Christy asks, is Salt Lake City's proposal considered best practice after looking at other comparable cities? And they note that you had mentioned like Denver, Nick.
Right. So we did look at other cities to determine what best practices there are. And what we've discovered is that every city does it slightly different. Every city's facing the same kinds of issues that we are right now as in Salt Lake City. And those are, we have a lot of places have growing homeless populations. It's expensive to provide emergency shelter and services. And cities when they come to regulating these, kind of run the gamut. So what we primarily looked at were 3 intermountain cities, Reno, Denver, and Boise, not necessarily to see best practices, but to gain insight into how they were operating. We chose those cities, one, because they're either comparable to Salt Lake City, or they have faced a larger issue than we have, like Denver. But we also have to take into consideration some of the realities of looking at other cities. For example, Denver is both a city and a county, and they provide much different services than we do as a city. And so they have more oversight into a broader range of things than the city does. When we were looking at Reno, for example, they list homeless shelters as a conditional use, but they only allow a total of 3 in the city, 1 for men, 1 for women and families, and then 1 for people with suffering from mental health issues. And so we didn't really see those as best practices. Boise is fairly similar to our old process, where they allow it as a conditional use in a limited number of places. So it's really hard to find a best practice in the United States because, one, every city is different, and to be blunt, a lot of cities haven't done a great job of responding to homeless issues.
Another question that comes up, and I think naturally, right, the people who are most affected by the location of homeless resource centers aren't the neighborhoods, it's not the police, it's not the providers as much as the folks experiencing homelessness or on the verge of experiencing homelessness. How does this proposal benefit those folks who would be using these resource centers and these shelters?
I can answer that one. Thank you, Brian. The process really creates an opportunity for the City Council to consider funding needs of the operator, as well as impact to essential city services. And that's really from the beginning of requesting to map this homeless resource center overlay. So it does provide the city the ability to make sure that best practice is in place and that we can meet the needs of the unsheltered community.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It also gives the city council the ability and the time to consider what kinds of additional help and resources might be needed given the future location of a resource center. And so whether that's access to mental health or addiction treatment or job placement or finding more permanent supportive housing, by having the council also consider the impact of the city services, it opens that level of discussion. And so it's a more comprehensive look at the issues than versus what the conditional use process would look at, which really is limited to the impacts and how those can be reduced. And under Utah code, all cities in Utah are required to approve a conditional use if there is an impact that could be even reduced by a small amount.
Another question, speaking of those impacts, is people are asking about how these homeless resource centers might impact the police department. With the resource centers that exist now, have there, as you're looking through this proposal, have you looked at the data about how they've impacted police use in those areas and how they would impact things if one of these overlays was approved?
Yes, we have analyzed that data and we've engaged with the representatives from the police department from the beginning of this process to try to understand their needs as well as the existing impacts to providing their service to the entire city. And so if we were working on mapping this overlay to a new property, the police representatives would be involved from the beginning to provide feedback on what they would need as their department is considered. And then city council, like Nick just said, could take that into consideration when applying this overlay to adjust funding or the needs of the police department so that they can provide service to a new homeless resource center. Additionally, the 2017 conditional use required a security and operations plan with any new established homeless resource center. And so we would still require a security and operations plan to make sure that the center was providing adequate security for individuals utilizing it.
There's a clarification that someone had asked for as far as in the presentation, you said that existing homeless resource centers largely wouldn't be affected by this. Could you just elaborate on that? Like, what happens if they need to expand or do something different? Like, in what ways could this impact some of those existing resource centers?
Absolutely. So the existing homeless resource centers have an approved conditional use. There are expansion allowances and modifications that can happen to structures with an approved conditional use. And so they would have that flexibility to make expansions, any changes to the structure within what's allowed under an approved conditional use. There would likely become a threshold depending on what's proposed where it would be best in some scenarios to map the proposed overlay to the existing homeless resource centers.
So Haley from Facebook asks, how have individuals experiencing homelessness weighed in on the proposal? How did you reach out to those folks? How did you engage them as part of this process?
Thank you for that question, Haley. So staff, about 3 of us from our office, toured the 2 operating homeless resource centers in the city, met with service providers, and then another staff member engaged with about 50 individuals in an active encampment to get their feedback on their needs and how they think that a new homeless resource center could be integrated into a community. And so we received really vital input from that engagement session as well.
As a follow-up to that, how can folks experiencing homelessness actually take part in the discussion for these overlays? If the overlay plan is passed, how is there a mechanism in that proposal to make sure that those folks are engaged, even if they might not have, they might not live within 300 feet or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, how does that part of the engagement process work to make sure that they're involved and because they're the biggest stakeholders here?
Absolutely. And we intend to engage with the unsheltered community so that we can get vital input on this proposal as well as future siting of homeless resource centers. This was brought up in one of the stakeholder meetings as far as what's the best practice and how to best engage and get that input provided. And I think we're discussing this amongst staff, but potentially having events or having a table at an existing center so that we can engage and get feedback, working with service providers to maybe have a small group discussion as well. And so everything's on the table at this point.
Yeah, I think this is one of those points that we will be making some changes to the proposal to ensure that happens. It's absolutely critical, I think, for the city to understand and put the needs of those people who would be utilizing any future homeless resource center and services.
Before we get to the next question, I just was wondering if like there's some sort of acknowledgement we could make in this that this is just one little piece of the puzzle of homelessness, and that this overlay amendment isn't going to solve that problem. It's just one more tool the city's going to be able to use for that. Because I think there's a tendency from folks to say like, well, this is the only thing the city's doing about it. But I think this is just a small part of what the city's doing about it, right?
Yeah, that's right. So one thing that I mean, this is the kind of the lower tool, right? We know we need homeless shelters and homeless resource centers for now. We know we need a process for that. But in order to adequately address and decrease the number of people who are experiencing homelessness, there's other things that have to happen related to housing. First and foremost is having more permanent supportive housing in the region. That's a bottom line that we have to do. I know that the various levels of government are all looking at that. And we know that it's something that Salt Lake City can't do on its own. But we're also willing to do what we need to do to ensure that people have a safe shelter. So I think, and to move out of having to use the resource centers or another shelter.
Haley asked another follow-up on the Facebook about whether or not we could hold live broadcasted meetings at the current resource centers. And that's definitely something that Salt Lake City TV Media and our team makes available. So for the people running those resource centers, they have every opportunity to run those meetings and show the live broadcasts on them. We broadcast everything. If you want to go to the slc.gov website or our YouTube, we live broadcast everything there. So there that availability is for them. I think the onus would be on the service providers to make that available for those folks. Another question that we have is, people are saying like, is it possible that a homeless resource center could be located in my neighborhood? And if so, when would that happen?
Yeah, it's definitely possible under this proposal. So one of the reasons why we took this approach is that we felt that if we try to identify zoning districts where this use should be allowed as a conditional use or even a permitted use, that it wouldn't give people either the opportunity to weigh in or wouldn't give the city decision makers the ability to make that decision based on a broad range of information. And so if there is a proposal, there's a lot of realities that would have to be factored into. One is simply the size of the property, right? We know that homeless resource center requires a certain amount of land. And if every lot is, I think the existing resource centers are all at least 2 acres, but of land. So they give you an idea, but it's certainly possible, especially as we have aging institutional buildings that maybe past their life, and those property owners may be looking to sell them or transfer them or move to a different site, and they become available. So it's hard to say when, because we don't know when that need's gonna arise. It could be soon, it could be years down the road. But the important thing is that if there were a proposal, is that, and Kelsey touched on this, there's ample notice that goes out to neighbors and community organizations and anybody else who wants to stay up to date on what we're doing in the planning division through our email listserv, to weigh in so that we can include that input in the decision-making process.
As far as that decision-making process, who's ultimately responsible for making that decision? It's not necessarily the community, right? Like no matter how much they put their input into it, ultimately it's the city council, right?
That's
yep.
Sorry, Nick.
And they would be there through every step of the process, or planning has to offer their input first?
Yeah, so it's kind of a tiered process. Sorry, Kelsey, I didn't mean to step on you, but
No.
So first, there's community input. That's kind of fact gathering, issue identification types of process. That's that 45-day notice period that our code requires. And then from there, the planning division works with all the other city departments who play a role in coming up with a recommendation to the planning commission. And the planning commission, in turn, makes their own recommendation to the city council. And ultimately, the city council makes that decision. All of that is a public process. And so there's multiple opportunities for people to hear what other city departments are saying, to read and hear what other community members are saying and service providers, and to weigh in themselves. And then the council would, as the elected body of the city, the legislative body of the city, would make that final decision.
Another question we have that people seem to have a little bit of anxiety about is with this zoning overlay, with this amendment that you're proposing, actually create authorized camping for folks who don't use homeless resource centers or shelters?
No, it wouldn't. That under zoning, that would be considered a different type of use. The definition of homeless resource center focuses on it being enclosed buildings. And the regulations require enclosed buildings, and so it's not going to authorize camping or a common campground type of arrangement.
I think that sort of goes to show how interrelated a lot of these issues are that planning doesn't necessarily have control over. We have another question from Lori on Facebook, and Lori asks, has the mayor and the city council read the Pioneer Park Coalition's proposal that was released last month? Has that had any impact on, I mean, you're not the mayor of the city council, but as the planning division, has that had any impact in the proposal that you're putting forward?
At this point, I think we're still trying to figure out that proposal. I've read what they posted on their website and their press release, but I haven't necessarily seen the details yet. So I think we'll be getting into that because we know we're going to get more questions about it. But I don't speak for I don't know if the mayor or the city council have read that or what their response to it is.
As we look to we have one more question from Facebook. What is the planning division doing to educate the community on homelessness? And I feel like, again, that's another one of those things where it's like other departments of the city are doing that, and planning is just sort of adapting to that from their narrow slice of the pie.
Right. Most of that education really comes from those people in the city administration who focus on homeless issues. We have a very small role in that, and that's really from the land use perspective. And so we're probably not the best people to educate the community on on all things homelessness, right? But I know within the mayor's office, there's Andrew Johnson, who is focused on that as the homeless policy director of the city. And then there's other people in housing stability that also help with that. And I know that they work closely with other government entities at the state and county level, as well as other service providers to help provide that education.
And just to add to Nick's comment, we are the zoning experts in the really big picture, which is just such a small fraction.
Well, on that issue though, before we wrap up, like, you know, as you look at zoning and you look at the way zoning affects things, and you look at the way zoning sort of has this cascading effect, that I think the zoning is part of what has made Salt Lake City grow so, you know, prodigiously over the last, you know, decade or so. As you look at those zoning issues, do you feel like this proposal is going to reduce the impact to neighborhoods that have homeless resource centers in them? And are those impacts actually even as large as maybe some people might think they are?
Well, I think to tackle that second part first, I mean, the reality of the impacts are how they're perceived and received by those people who are experiencing it. And so I don't know that it's fair for us to say whether or not the impacts are big or as big as people say or not, because, you know, everyone has their own experiences with that. But I will say that in terms of reducing the impacts, what this proposal does is that in contrast to the conditional use process, is that this allows the city council to consider a much broader range of resources that could be impact both positive and negatively in an area when someone's proposing a future homeless resource center, where the planning commission, as the approval body for a conditional use, doesn't really have that insight. You know, they can't direct city funds. They don't have a role in how the budget is used and things like that. They're strictly focused at the land use impacts, where the city council can look at broader impacts. The other thing that has kind of spun out of the listening sessions that we've done all summer is that there are some other things that the city might be able to do to help reduce those things that are attractive nuisances, right? Particularly boarded buildings has been a big focus and kind of risen to the top of some other things that we could do, that we would be involved with helping our civil enforcement group maybe hold those property owners that allow buildings to be boarded for a significant period of time to hire to an appropriate level and standard to ensure that those do not become attractive resources and that they're secured, or if they're past that point of being reused, to demolish those structures when it's appropriate.
So that's it for our questions from Facebook. And I'm curious if either of you have anything else you want to leave the community with, anything you want to tell people about this amendment, and just remind people what the next steps are.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, you know, go to that website that we've shared. You can get it at our planning division website as well. And you can find that by reviewing this presentation, because it was posted in there. But that's the best way to learn more and provide your inputs directly. You know, I think engagement is absolutely, and the input from the community is absolutely critical to these kinds of proposals, because we know that, like we said from the beginning, that zoning is very limited in how it can address some of the issues. And so we need to know what those are so that we can incorporate the factors in for the decision makers, so that they are getting that information and can weigh it appropriately.
All right, so I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the event. There would be no city in general without your participation in what we're doing. I'd also like to thank you, Nick and Kelsey, for your work on this and your ability to very succinctly answer the questions that have been coming in from the public about this issue. I want to remind everyone that a recording of this presentation will be available on Facebook immediately after, and shortly after that on YouTube on the city's SLC TV YouTube channel. And for more information about the amendment itself, please visit slc.gov/HRC-amendments. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.